Are you living the life that you would like to live? And as I ask you that question, I'm not asking, do you wish you had more money or more power or more fame? I'm simply asking a much simpler question than that. In your life, are the things that you say are important to you, do you live your life with those things as the most important things? In other words, do you actually prioritize in your life what you say are your priorities? Because I think we find that we spend much of our lives doing things completely counter to what we say are important to us. For years I said that my family was really important to me, yet I would spend 40 weeks a year away at work. I know people who say that, I'm really seeking peace in my life, but their lives are filled with drama. Right? That I don't know that we consciously choose those things, but what I do know, that if we don't consciously choose our priorities, the rest of life is going to decide what gets prioritized in our life. So what I'd like to do today is these past few weeks, they haven't really been a series, but there's been a common theme, which is this idea of living a life of purpose. And as part of doing that, what I've been trying to do throughout these past few weeks is look at Bible passages that are very familiar. That if you're someone who's been in church for any length of time, you've almost definitely heard them before. Even if you're not a person who has gone to church much of your life, I tried to use passages that you would probably know. And so today I want to do that same sort of thing, but looking at how we actually apply our priorities in our life. How does that actually dictate and direct our life? Because I truly believe that you are created on purpose with a purpose by God. And if you're going to have a purposeful life, a life that has a life of meaning, a life that makes a difference in your circle of influence, you've got to do it intentionally. And you've got to decide what your priorities are, and you've got to choose to live by those priorities. But now, as I've mentioned that each of the past few weeks, I've tried to use a very familiar Bible passage. And today's, I'm going to bet you can guess it as soon as I show you the title. So the title is, Who is My Neighbor? So what is the narrative I'm going to talk about? The Good Samaritan. Right? The Good Samaritan. Right? That one of Jesus' most famous parables is the parable of the Good Samaritan. But like we've done in all the other cases, we've looked at well-known passages, but we've tried to look deeper to see, what was going on that we didn't necessarily hear about before, maybe didn't necessarily think about before. And so what I want to do as we go through this narrative of the Good Samaritan, I actually want to look at first the situation that led to Jesus telling this parable. And who was he talking to at the time, and what kind of point was he trying to make to that person? And I guess the first thing is, before I even get into it, we use the word parable all the time. What is a parable? It's important to understand that. A parable is a fictional story that is told to make a point, right? It's much like a fable, like Aesop's fable sort of thing. So when Jesus tells a parable, he's making the story up, but he's trying to make a point with it. And so the parable of the Good Samaritan is a fictional story that Jesus is telling, but it actually addresses a very real question that comes up. Now, this narrative comes to us from the gospel author Luke. And Luke is a really interesting gospel author because Luke, unlike Matthew and John, never met Jesus. He was actually a close companion of the Apostle Paul's. And so Luke's gospel is actually a big research project. That Luke went out and he talked to people who had actually seen Jesus and met Jesus, and people who'd seen the various things that had gone on. And Luke compiles all of that into what we call the Gospel of Luke. And so Luke actually records for us this encounter that Jesus has with a particular religious leader. So Luke tells us this. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Now, there's a couple of things that are going on there, right? An expert in the law, right? This doesn't mean that he was a police officer, right? This is a person who was expert in their religious law. In other words, the law as it's laid out in the Old Testament. right? And so for them, this dictated their relationship with God, their relationship with one another, the way society was supposed to function. So this was a guy who was an expert in that. So he's a form of a religious leader. And notice, why is he even talking to Jesus? To test him. Is he really who he says he is? I keep hearing all this stuff about this guy. He makes all these claims about himself. I'm going to try to get to the bottom of this. So the expert in the law says to Jesus, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, it's kind of interesting that if you've been in church your whole life and you come from a New Testament perspective, as all of us probably do, that we know the answer to that question, right? You simply accept the fact that God loved you so much that through the work of Jesus, he's given you a path to eternity with God by faith. In the New Testament, that's really clear. In the Old Testament, that's not really as clear. The Old Testament doesn't really talk in super specific terms about what is the path to eternity in the kingdom of God. So something that religious people at that time might do is actually debate that. And it's a culture that really, really values debate. How well do you make your argument? So what this religious leader is doing is he's going to Jesus, "Hey, I'm going to ask you this question that we're kind of debating all the time. Let's see how well you make your argument. And that'll help me understand who you are." Now, if you've ever read anything from the gospel, you've ever heard anyone read the gospel to you, you know that when people try to test Jesus, it generally doesn't go the way they thought it was going to go. Right? So Jesus, when you ask him a question, how does he normally answer a question? With another question. So the guy says, "Well, so what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus says, "Well, what is written in the law? How do you read it?" "Well, you're the expert. You say you're an expert in the law. What do you see when you're there, when you read through it? You tell me your interpretation of it." And so the religious leader responds. He says, "Well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind." So be all in on loving God and love your neighbor as yourself. And it's kind of interesting that the religious leader has pretty much nailed his answer, right? That we are to love God, that we are to love other people. And he's actually done it really well, because all that he kind of talks about there are some key chapters in the Old Testament. The book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, Leviticus, chapter 19, both talk about all these things. In fact, the love your neighbor as yourself comes directly from Leviticus 19:18. So the guy's really, really answering it well. In fact, if you know the Ten Commandments, I'm not going to ask you to, if you memorize them, right? Because good news is we don't live under the Ten Commandments. We have something much better than that, right? But the Ten Commandments have 4 of them that are about loving God, and 6 of them are about loving other people. So in that one answer, this guy has done a really good job. So Jesus goes on and says, "Well, you have answered correctly." Right? So he compliments the guy, going, "Yeah, you know what? You know the answer. You know the right thing to say." Great. He knows what he's supposed to know. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He says, "Do this, and you will live." What is Jesus saying to the man? Knowledge is great. Study is great. But it's about a lot more than what you know. It's about more than what you feel. It's even about more than what you believe. What matters is what you do. That we are to live out our faith. That we are to take action consistent with faith. Yes, that salvation is by grace. It is a free gift from God through Jesus. But what you do matters. And so basically what Jesus is saying to this man is that you know all that stuff, but go do that. Live things that way. Live your life that way. And what's interesting is that, the hard part of this, what the guy's answer was, which was love your neighbor as yourself. Are you loving to every human being that you encounter? Like no laughs, nothing? I'll try that again. You get in line at the grocery store. You're in the 10 items or less lane. And that guy in front of you has 15 items. But he claims that all the laundry-based stuff is really just one thing, right? Right, and how do you react to that? No, we made the joke last week that if I recorded you in your car while you were in traffic or stuck behind somebody, right? We all do things that are inconsistent with being loving to people. And the religious leader that Jesus is talking to knows that he does the same sort of thing, that he is not consistently loving to other people. So he responds by doing what lawyers do, right? He's a legal expert, right? So what he tries to do is he tries to shift the narrative. Because Jesus says, well, do what that says and you will live. And the guy kind of gets a question. Well, I'm not loving to everyone, but I can't be wrong. In fact, Luke actually tells us the religious leader wanted to justify himself. In other words, he wanted to justify the fact that he knew he was not loving to other people, at least not to everyone. So he asked Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? What does the word neighbor really mean? Right? And I have to, I have conversations like this often with people where we talk about things that we use words that we all know, but as soon as you throw them in a religious context or in a kind of appropriate human behavior context, well, what does generosity really mean anyway? Right? That suddenly we start kind of, we become, Merriam and Webster in one. Right? And we're going to chase down the full definition of every word along the way. Well, who is my neighbor really? I mean, my neighbor are people who are just like me, right? My people are people who look like me, who think like me, who act like me. Certainly my neighbor only counts people who believe just the way I believe and treat me well. That's my neighbor, right? Because those people, oh yeah, I'm loving to people who are just like that. But you can't expect me to act loving towards everyone else because that person's clearly not my neighbor, right? So again, the man said to Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? And again, how does Jesus answer a question? Another question. Or sometimes he has a very long lead into that question, which we'll get to. The lead-in is the parable of the Good Samaritan, by the way. But what's interesting is that there is no doubt that Jesus had the ability to do a point-by-point takedown of this guy's attitude. Right? He could have gone through, cited all the scriptures, pulled all the pieces together and going, you know better than that. But he didn't do it that way. Instead, he told the parable. Luke tells us this. In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. Now, you and I hear that line, you go, okay, well, that's the opening part of the story. Someone's traveling from the city of Jerusalem down to Jericho. Okay, you got attacked, that seems bad. But for the first century audience, they heard something very different. Because you got to remember that whenever someone was challenging Jesus, a crowd would naturally develop. Because everyone wanted to see what would happen and see what he would say. And so Jesus knows that. So as he describes this man from Jerusalem, a Jewish person, traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, they don't just hear a person's on a journey. They knew that road from Jerusalem to Jericho was a 17-mile-long, hilly road through the desert with lots of turns and hills and lots of places for bad people to hide. And they knew that it was poorly protected, that when you got outside from the cities, there was no protection. You were on your own. So they knew that someone traveling on that road who was who was attacked and severely injured and lost all their stuff, that things were not going to go good for them. In fact, Jesus carries on and he says, they stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. So for the first century audience, they're like, he's half dead now. Unless somebody steps in, he's going to be dead. Right? I mean, no one's going to pull out their cell phone and call 911, right? Right? That this person is kind of on their, not kind of, they are on their own unless someone decides to get involved. Unless someone decides to get involved and make a difference. Unless someone decides that says, you know what, this is a messy situation, but I'm willing to wade into that mess. Because that's another human being. that needs help and needs support. So as they hear this kind of opening to what to us is just the opening part of the narrative, Jesus has set an incredible stage for what this situation looks like. Right now, as Jesus continues the parable, he tells us that someone comes along. He says a priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, what did the priest do? Pass by on the other side. Do you think the priest knew the law? Did he know you're supposed to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind? Did he know you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself? Yet here's a person who's in need of help. He's in need of an act that is loving. And the priest makes sure he puts lots of distance between the man and keeps going. Now, I would imagine, Jesus doesn't say this specifically, but I would imagine that the priest in this could have easily justified that choice. Because in the first century, a religious concept called being ceremonially clean had been elevated to have a great deal of importance. And what being ceremonially clean was is that you had to be in a specific state where you had not been corrupted in order to participate in certain religious activities. And so the priest could have easily said, well, that guy, if he's sick or if he dies while I'm with him, I'm going to become ceremonially unclean. And I won't be able to do my priest work. And and there are a lot of people who depend on me for my priest work. So I'm afraid it's not really my problem because my religion is more important than a person's well-being. My religious traditions matter more than giving someone the help and care they need. That he valued his status, his lifestyle, all the way down to his religious traditions, even knowing what his faith itself taught. He valued all those things more than getting involved in an act that's loving towards someone who is in desperate need of help. So the priest just keeps going. But Jesus says another man comes along now. And you can imagine that if you're this man in the narrative who's been beaten up and you're laying down there and you're beaten kind of almost to death, Jesus says, and maybe you're coming in and out of consciousness and you see the priest go by and, well, that's strange. But you see someone else coming, right? Maybe this person will help. It says, so too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. Now, a Levite is another kind of religious leader. It's someone that we think of as kind of a temple assistant. Someone who would have certainly known to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So he sees the man there, and he keeps moving. He does nothing. Right? Both of these men know the law. They know to love God. They know to love their neighbor. Yet neither appeared to see this man as their neighbor, even though he was a man from Jerusalem, so he would have had a lot in common with them. And so clearly, although they have lots of knowledge on this subject, their actions are not consistent with it. Right? That these religious leaders were more concerned about their power, their status, their position, their religion, than they were about people. The thing that we are called to love and take care of. And I would imagine that my hope is that as Jesus tells this parable, remember that he's telling this parable to this other kind of religious leader, a guy who's called an expert in the law. And the hope is as this man hears all these things, that his heart's being moved a bit, right? There's a term we use called being convicted, right? Being convicted is not a bad thing, right? Being convicted means that you recognize that your own behavior is inconsistent with something, and you make a decision to let go of that behavior. And clearly what Jesus was doing here was calling out people who put their religious tradition over the actions that we are called to live out in our lives. He was calling out people who put position and power and convenience and comfort, and I'll say it again, religion, over loving people, caring for people, who did not put a priority on taking action that lifted people up, who did not put a priority on taking action that changes lives. who did not put a priority on taking action that changes lives. Now, as Jesus continues the narrative, he introduces in a character that no one standing there would have expected. Jesus goes on to say, but a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. Now, you have probably heard this parable many, many times. What is a Samaritan? Yeah, I didn't know for a long time either. It's okay. All right. A Samaritan is actually someone who follows a religious tradition different than the Jews did. They had a lot that overlaps with it, but they had some significant differences. And there was tension between first century Jews and Samaritans, that they both felt like they had their religion all wrong. So basically, Jesus is introducing this character, this Samaritan, who has his religion all wrong. That he doesn't believe the right things. He doesn't do the right things. He doesn't live the way you're supposed to, according to the other side. But notice what the Samaritan does. And when the Samaritan saw the man on the ground, the Samaritan took pity on him. He saw someone who needed help. And he didn't push down that feeling. We know when we see someone who's in need, we get that thing that happens in our stomach, like we want to do something. But then we go, well, that's going to be kind of inconvenient. That's going to be hard. That's going to be messy. I got places I got to be. I got things I got to do. And we push those things down and we don't get involved. We don't do the good that we could do. But the Samaritan doesn't let that happen. He decided that in this moment, he could not carry on with his life as usual. He had to get involved. And the Samaritan does what the religious leaders would not. So the Samaritan went to the man, bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Right? Basically, he took care of the man. Despite the fact that there was this difficult relationship between Jews and Samaritans, he didn't worry about that. And in reality, this Samaritan would have been fully aware that the man he was currently helping, if the situation had been reversed, may not have actually helped him. But he did it anyway. Their differences didn't matter. Their different viewpoints didn't matter. Their different lifestyles didn't matter. Their different views of how faith is accomplished didn't matter. This was a human being in need. And so he did what he could. In fact, he goes even further. Jesus goes on to say that then the Samaritan put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. Now think about this. This Samaritan, like everyone else, had some place he had to be, right? He had things he had to do. No one walks this 17-mile lonely road for fun. He had things he had to do. But he decided that caring for this man outweighed the inconvenience of doing what was necessary. And what we see happening here is what we often refer to as stewardship, right? Is that the Samaritan is looking at his own life. And he takes this attitude that everything I have, my abilities, the time I have, these are gifts from God. They're not mine. I don't own those things. God has entrusted me with those things. And so the Samaritan says, well, God has entrusted me these things to do what God calls me to do. He calls me to love people. So even though I was kind of busy, I'm going to take my time, to use my time to take care of this man. I'm going to use the basic first aid skills I have to do what I can for this man. And then he goes even further, right? So they're at the inn. It says, then the next day, the Samaritan took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, look after him. Now, denarii is money. And generally speaking, we describe a denarii as the value of 1 day's wages. So what the Samaritan did is he says, well, here's 2 days' wages. I will give you that to take care of this man. And then he goes even further. And he says, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. And you notice what he's done is he's taken stewardship to another level. That not only is my time not mine, it's a gift from God. Not only are my abilities not mine, but a gift from God. My resources are not mine. They're a gift from God. And I am meant to steward those well, to do the work God calls me to do. So what happened here is that after he invested so much of his time and ability, the situation reached a point where the man needed help that the Samaritan himself could not provide. So what did the Samaritan do? He funded a project, an organization that would actually could provide that help. He gave his money to provide the care that he himself could not provide. And you notice that what the Samaritan is showing us is that he is all in on doing what he can, using his personal skills, his personal time, and using his resources to fund further care for this individual. And so Jesus lays all this out. And then Jesus turns back to the expert in the law. He says, hey, remember that question that you asked? You said, which one of these men, who is my neighbor? So he says to the expert in the law, you asked, who is my neighbor? Now Jesus answers that question with a question after the long lead-in. He says, well, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? And it's interesting, right? Because the first two, the priest and the Levite, really were kind of the man's neighbor, right? They were from the same culture. They might have even lived in the same neighborhood. They were actually his neighbor. Yet the third man had very little in common with that man. Culture said that they were at odds with one another. But he saw that person as someone who was a child of God, deserving of care and love. And so as Jesus asked that question, so in this whole story, who was this man's neighbor? And the expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Actions matter. And so just in the event that you fell asleep at any point in the past 20 minutes or so, I'm going to say something. If you missed everything else that I said, just hear the next thing I say, or actually what Jesus says as I repeat it, and you won't have missed anything. Right? So he says that the expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on me. What does Jesus tell the guy to do? Go and do likewise. See, there's somehow that we live in a time of opinions, political opinions, religious outlooks, oppositions in faiths, struggling against one another, my side, your side, us and them. Jesus says there's no place for any of that, that we are all human beings, and we are to do the work that God calls us to do. And if you think about that opening scripture I started out with this morning, that when we do good, it's a chance to point people towards a life with Jesus, so people will come to know the Father. And so if we start excluding people because they are different, or because it is inconvenient, or wow, I didn't really feel like putting up with that today, Jesus says, well, you're not doing likewise. You're not loving your neighbor as yourself. You're loving your neighbor as long as it's not too hard, it's not too inconvenient. And you're not using the gifts that I've given you to make the difference that I've called you to make. My friends, that we are each called to live an intentional life of purpose, right? We all have struggles. We all get things wrong. We all have things in our lives that we wish we could get out of them that we can't. But what we can do is show up and do things that make a difference in people's lives. I mean, that's why we're doing the collection for Concord Coalition to End Homelessness, right? That's why we have our food pantry. That's why we cooperate with the Open Door Community Kitchen to have a soup kitchen here, so that we can serve those around us, right? And we want to look for those opportunities as a church, but each and every one of you, me included, have people in our lives that we interact with, that we have a chance to make a difference in their lives. And if we will recognize that loving our neighbors means being willing to do good for people who may not do it for you, but you do it anyway, because it honors God, and it might just point someone towards God. That is a life of purpose. That is a life of meaning. And that's what Jesus is inviting you into. But you've got to make the choice to step into it. And if you will do it, it will transform you. It will be hard, it will be challenging, and it will be more gratifying than anything you have ever done. If you will follow that path. If you're not sure what God's calling you towards, of course, we always ask that you support the ministry-wide things that we're doing. But also just be praying to God about where you can make a difference. Who in your life that you can interact with? Who's that person that you kind of see there's something they're dealing with, and you're like, I don't know. Maybe that's who God's leading you towards. I don't know the answer. But if you seek that answer from him, he will lead you there because God is calling you into a life of purpose and meaning and fullness. Step into that.